ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده، إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.
Afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to another episode of Islamic Literary Society interviews. Before we introduce our special guest today, just wanted to mention some of the things ILS have been doing. For those who have been following us and those who are our patrons, really thank you for making these episodes possible. We've had quite a busy schedule of interviews on numerous publications, numerous important authors, and we're finding that we're receiving a lot of great appreciation from our audiences. We have a long schedule of authors and academics who want to engage with ILS and want to come on the program. So all that's possible thanks to your support and for you advertising and spreading the work that we do here. And the ILS really was a society founded only a few years ago, and the aim is really to promote and foster, develop, heighten appreciation of authors and their works, particularly literary works of classical contemporary scholarship. Not only is ILS sort of involved in doing interviews with professional authors and academics and scholars, but there are reading clubs. We're part of book launches. We have critical reviews, we have online events and on-site events, we have discussion groups and sometimes closed door meetings, but also open for the public access. So the aim really is to encourage the revival of leadership through reading and studying and bringing about sort of awareness of the importance of the written tradition. Of course, ILS is particularly focused on those writing and operating within the field of Islamic studies broadly. However, we have plans to have a lot of interreligious, inter-genre sort of work. So do follow us on our website and our social media platforms for more on that. Really, I don't want to take too much time explaining all these things. It was really for those viewers who really join us new, but our familiar audience know the repertoire of our program. So again, to turn to now to another episode, book interview. I'm really excited. I really am to introduce our special guest, Dr. Paul Naylor, today. To discuss his book, and I am particularly excited, and I'm sure through some those who I haven't spoken to, but the private messages I've received, this is a very, very interesting topic, and I hope that through this episode today, you get a greater appreciation of the book, which I have here with me. I think it can be seen. So from rebels to rulers, it is a catchy title, but hopefully we'll some of the stuff that's in the book will jump out today for you, and Dr. Naylor will try and bring it to life. And it is a thoroughly researched book, so inevitably this sort of episode, unfortunately, is not going to capture the nuance and the rigor and the high caliber of research in the book, but hopefully through some discussion and questions, we can tease out some themes, get our own discussion going, and hopefully you two can pick up the threads of what we discuss here and take it to however you like to take it. But I do urge everyone, those who are working who are librarians, get a copy. Those who are working in colleges, institutions who have access, who have a budget, this is a must purchase, I think. So please do keep some aside in your budget to purchase that book. Now, before I introduce you, I have to, of course, do a formal introduction. I know often authors don't like that, but I promise it will be kept short. So Dr. Paul Naylor gained his PhD in 2019 from the University of Birmingham's Department of African Studies and Anthropology. He has since then taught courses on Islamic history and African studies at Tulane University in New Orleans, and Loyola University in Chicago. He currently works as a catalogue of West African manuscripts at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota. What an enviable job. Paul, may I welcome you to ILS episode book interview this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saf. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Brilliant. Just on that job of cataloguing the manuscripts, I mean, I'm a manuscript lover, and I just, tell me something. What do you do? Tell our audience, what does a cataloger do?
So just to give some context, so the Hill Museum Manuscript Library works in mainly in conflict zones to protect at-risk cultural heritage. And so in 2012, there was political violence in the north of Mali. And Timbuktu, of course, has this kind of mythical reputation as the center of Islamic learning, the center of manuscript production and reading. And so a lot of these manuscripts, the fear was that they would be damaged in the violence. And so a lot of these manuscripts, both the public archives and there's over 30 private family libraries in Timbuktu, they were evacuated to Bamako, the Malian capital. And then my organization, Hill Museum, a manuscript library, as well as other international partners, started to digitize and preserve all these manuscripts. And so they're just about to finish, I think, in the next few months. And so we've got over 300,000 manuscripts.
Wow.
And so this is my job and the job of my colleague, Dr. Ali Diakite, to catalog these manuscripts and to put them online for everybody to see. Okay. And so we've cataloged about 15,000. So it's probably a job for life, if you want it. We have a lot of work more to do, but we're uncovering all sorts of amazing stories, new authors, new books that are not known outside of the region. So it's a really exciting project. And so you can go to vhemel.org. And anybody can view these manuscripts. You just have to create an account and view them. So
I'll get a link in there.
I encourage everybody to do that.
Fantastic. Wow. I mean, and this is free access, right? This is
free access. You just create an account. vhemel.org.
Fantastic. Wow. I told you it'll be an enviable job.
So I just catalog manuscripts for most of the day, digital, so they're all on the screen. I work on Zoom most days, to be honest, because we have colleagues all over the world. So it's a good good job for someone who likes manuscripts in my field. So.
Wow. Yeah, no, I'm a manuscript lover myself, and when I saw that this is what you're doing, I thought there is no other better job to do than that. Wow. Amazing. Well, thank you for that. Now, I know, often we are constrained by time, but really, I don't want to waste any time me tattering. I really want to get down to talking about the book, and it's an excellent book. So I'm just going to share something for our audience so they know what I'm going to be asking, so they can have a visual to appreciate. Those who are going to be watching this on Zoom, you should be able to see a set of slides. Are you able to see that?
Yep. Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. So that's our landing slide there. The title of the book, From Rebels to Rulers, Writing Legitimacy in the Early Sokoto State. So this is the book. Really, it's just fresh off the press. And I really can't wait to get into it and talking with, have the honor of talking to the author about it directly. Right, so I'm going to jump straight in and talk about setting up the first question. Now, I know, as I mentioned before, this is a fantastic book, and it really is. You've really gone to pains to set up the key protagonists of this academic research. Now, I don't want to be presumptuous about our audience, but and I'm talking about also my own ignorance, many Muslim audiences aren't familiar with the region that you've written about,
Sure.
and these sort of jihadist scholars, you know, in this part of sort of the sort of the Sahel region of Africa. So can you remedy some of this unfamiliarity, I'll say ignorance on my part? Who are these rebels into rulers, as you label them? Why are they?
Sure. Yeah, no, with pleasure. So the book takes place in the Sahel region. So Sahel, it's an Arabic word meaning a coast. And so if you imagine the Sahara Desert as this ocean, so it's not this this impenetrable boundary, but it's an ocean. You know, it always has been seen as an ocean in which people can cross.
Wow.
So the Sahel is that coast. If you imagine the desert as the ocean, the Sahel is the coast of this ocean. So it's between the Sahara Desert and the kind of tropical forest region of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a kind of semi-arid, semi-agricultural belt of land that goes from Senegal in the present-day Senegal in the Atlantic coast, all the way to the east to the Lake Chad region in what is now sort of Cameroon, northern Nigeria. And so this region, you know, the Sahel region, has a very long history when it comes to the diffusion of Islam. So Islam did not come through conquest as it did in the Maghreb, in North Africa. It came peacefully through commerce, through trade, through proselytization, so through scholars and traders crossing over this desert to sell their wares and also to spread the Islamic faith. And so the result of that is that for a very long time, at least since the 9th century, you know, Islam has had a presence in this region. And, you know, from at least, you know, let's say the 12th century, Islam has played a role in political systems in the region. And so for a long time, even before this jihad of Osman and Fodio in the 19th century, Islam had formed a part of state systems. And so something very interesting happens in the late 17th century. There are a series of these revivalist, reformist movements based around Islam that spread right across the Sahel. So from the Atlantic coast all the way to Lake Chad, one after the other. And so the Sokoto Jihad in 1804 is one of the last ones, one of the last of these kind of religious revolutions. And these revolutions have a lot in common. They're started not by politicians, but by scholars, Muslim scholars and clerics, mostly from rural regions, who are challenging the urban centers of power. And all of them come from the Fulani ethnic group. So these are essentially nomadic people who traditionally lived in this Sahel region, mostly dealing with herding cattle, with livestock rearing, and also with scholarship, with Muslim scholarship. And so Osman Dan Fodio was one of these clerics born in the Hausa countryside, so in the present-day North Nigeria, and he started preaching against the Hausa. So the Hausa kingdoms were these small statelets, really, in the north of Nigeria. Each one had a king, and it's important to note that they considered themselves to be Muslims, so they would consider themselves to be ruling through Islam. And so he started saying, actually, we don't believe that you're creating a true vision of Muslim governance. We think what you're doing is mixing Islam with traditional non-Muslim local beliefs. And for that reason, we want to either ask you to reform, or we're going to overthrow your government. So this was going on. He started these kind of preaching tours in the 1790s, and this culminated in the jihad of 1804. So just to take you to the second part of the question, why is it important? You know, why should we care about this? Sokoto was the largest and longest lasting of these jihadist states in West Africa. It encompassed parts of Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, Burkina Faso, Togo, Benin. This was a very large state indeed, and it lasted for just under 100 years, up until 1903, when the British actually annexed a lot of the territory of Sokoto to create the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. So this was perhaps the best example of a long-lasting, durable Muslim governance. in the region. And so it's not familiar, I know, to many people outside of the region, but in Nigeria today, especially, this legacy is very important. There's still a Sultan of Sokoto, there's still a ruler of Sokoto today. He doesn't hold official political power, but he's very important in Nigerian politics. And so this still matters. And the most important thing, and the reason I wrote the book, is because they left all of these hundreds of documents that they wrote behind them. You know, when they passed on, they left these hundreds of writings over their 30-year course, from what I say, from rebels against the House of Kings to rulers of this vast Muslim empire. So if we look at these documents, you know, in close detail, and in Arabic, I used Arabic documents. They also wrote in Hausa and for full day in local languages, but I used the Arabic documents. They can tell us a lot about concepts of Muslim governance in the region, concepts of legitimacy, and how the form of legitimacy changes over these 30 years with the rising power of the state, how their ideas change over this period. So I think that's a good intro.
Well, you mentioned they are reformist revivalists. So I know it's very clear that they were definitely, you know, jihad was very, very big. Sort of exporting the faith was part of, you know, their actions. But when you mean reformist revivalists, what do you have in mind for our audience?
So essentially, they were using, you know, a very established set of ideas in Islamic law that has been used time and time again, really to challenge political authorities by saying, look, you know, what you're doing is unorthodox. And so this concept of orthodoxy is not fixed, you know, and that's the problem with studying Muslim movements in the past. Historians often talk about orthodox and non-orthodox forms of Islam. But the thing is, the way you legitimize your cause is by saying that other people are unorthodox and that you are orthodox. So that is actually the skill. You know, there's no Orthodox Islam is not very useful as a concept, as I'm sure you'd agree. But they use this, the idea of orthodoxy to push their message, and by saying, look, the way that your leaders practice the faith is unorthodox, and so by following them, you're also being unorthodox, and so the only way to correct that is to follow us. Otherwise, we will also consider you to be unorthodox Muslims. You know, so there's very effective kind of discursive argument, which I call a discourse of dissent in the book, that has been used, you know, many times. If we look at through Muslim history, the same argument has been used many times to really push social change.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I think this point, you know, leads me really to one of the other questions that I had, and that is essentially because this concept of legitimacy, you really nail it, and in chapter 2 and 3, and again, our readers have to read the book really to get an appreciation of how Dr. Naylor builds from point to point sequentially to get you to the conclusion. I mean, I know in chapter 2, and then, you know, you explain, as you mentioned, you discuss the discursive tradition, but you also mentioned a discursive tradition of legitimacy within the Sahel region. And in chapter 3, you go into detail about how this clan, if I'm using the right word, or this sort of tribal group, the Fodiawa, exploited notions of legitimacy that helped them transform from being, you know, warriors on horseback to literally Amir al-Mu'mineen, like, you know, leaders of the believers, you know, sort of rulers. And then you mentioned fiqh, sort of Islamic positive law. You mentioned an epistemological idea, kashf, which roughly translates here and there's sort of knowledge that's unveiled and things like that. Not knowledge that's sort of it's not intellectual. And then you mentioned nasab, or genealogy. Now these ideas, how are they a cocktail? How do they make up the recipe for this legitimacy? How do they exploit it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and maybe it's best to come back a bit to what we mean by legitimacy, and so we can even use the contemporary context when you ask people, are your leaders legitimate? Is anything legitimate? Everybody will have a different answer, because legitimacy is this kind of fuzzy concept, and everybody will say will have a slightly different reason, but they'll have certain things in common, especially when we're talking about legitimate or illegitimate figures, people, leaders, politicians, etc. And so the same was true in the Muslim Sahel in the 19th century. And so what I try to do to kind of ease the reader into this concept of legitimacy, which, as I said, is fuzzy and inexact, the word legitimacy, I try to break it up into these three recognizable components, as you said. And so fiqh, people often translate it as Islamic jurisprudence, but it's kind of much wider than that, isn't it? It's this historical attempt by Muslims to understand what God wants us to do. How does God want us to lead our lives? And the way we look at that is we read the Quran, the Hadith, the books of law. We try to build this knowledge system. And so to be legitimate, the first aspect is demonstrating that you understand this knowledge system. And so you can interpret the Quran, you can quote extensively from established authors in this Islamic core curriculum of study, which in West Africa, as in other places, was quite rigorous. There were certain books that were must reads, for you to be qualified. And just like higher education today, it also mattered where you studied and who you studied with, who your teacher was and which center of learning you chose for your studies. And so the Fodiyawa all wrote kind of bibliographical works explaining the books that they'd read, who they'd read them with, and demonstrating that they understood Maliki law, especially. That was the prominent madhab in this part of the world, and that they'd learned all of these books. And so this demonstrated to the audience that they were members of this knowledge elite of scholars reading, writing, communicating in Arabic. So that's the first aspect. Now, kashf, and with kashf, this kind of unveiling, I try to get at this divide in Islam between al-zahir and al-batin. So the kind of the external elements of the faith and the internal elements of your relationship with God. And so in most parts of the world, it's really the Sufism that has kind of monopolized upon this batin, or this hidden world that moves beyond reason and scientific inquiries, to recognizing that religious conviction is mysterious, and God is in Abrahamic tradition, at least, is this willful being. He can provide direct, spontaneous knowledge to whoever he wants, and so the Fodiyawa also had to claim that they had this type of secret knowledge that had been denied to others. So, for example, it was spread around that Usman had received direct visions from Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. He's the founder of the Qadiriyya, this Sufi order that was popular in West Africa, and also claimed to know things about when the world would end, when the Mahdi, so the Islamic Messiah figure, would arrive, because 1790s, if we look at the Hijri calendar, this is 1200 Hijri, and people believed that this was just like people say, in the year 2000, in the Western calendar, they believed that all sorts of strange things would happen in this year, and so they really played into this narrative. They didn't deny that perhaps Usman could even have been the Mahdi. Certain of his followers believed that. Obviously, it didn't turn out to be true, but that was what motivated people, especially at a more popular level, to believe in the legitimacy of Usman as a scholar and a saint. So the last aspect, nasab, this kind of idea of a written noble genealogy, in Islam, that tends to come from an Arab origin, from claiming that your family had a direct role in the early Muslim story, during the Islamic conquest, or even during the time of Prophet Muhammad himself. And so it carries authority in any Muslim society. The descent, the Sharifian descent, or the descent from, in this case, the Fodiyawa claimed that the Torobbe. So this is like a kind of a caste of the Fulani who identify with Muslim scholarship. This kind of scholarly caste, if you want. They claimed that they were directly related to the first Arab conquerors of the Maghreb, of North Africa. And so kind of by birth, in a sense, they had the right also to rule Hausa land. So as I said, these three concepts were never explicitly mentioned, but I just tried to distill these legitimizing ideas from the manuscripts. This is what I came up with.
Yeah, no, I thought, that sort of that triangular picture of legitimacy, like knowledge of it, cements your legitimacy to be a ruler. And so, having special epistemological powers or access makes you more legitimate to be a ruler. And then, your noble, you translate as noble lineage, isn't it? Or noble origin.
Noble origin, yeah.
Noble origin, yeah. And then, and then sort of, claims of links to sort of the Ashraf, the noble, the noble lineages, the Arab noble class. That's interesting. I remember in chapter 2, I can't remember if it's chapter 2 or 3, I think in chapter 2, you specifically mentioned two North African sort of giants, one the polymath Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, and then the Algerian scholar al-Maghili, I think.
Yeah, al-Maghili, yes.
What was so specific about, why were those two particularly you felt had to be mentioned when it comes to this whole notion of legitimacy?
I think these two figures, so in West Africa, there's a long-standing belief that Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and al-Maghili visited West Africa. Right. They did a kind of tour, if you like, of the rulers at that time. And we're talking kind of 16th century here, so hundreds of years before the Fodiawa were around. But they were core parts of this core curriculum of study. At least al-Suyuti was, partly because he had visited the region. He'd sent letters to some of the rulers, and many of we don't know where these meetings actually took place. But the point was, people believed that they did, and people believed that these scholars had a connection to West Africa. And we want to, it gives us, it would be a sense of pride, that these great scholars had interacted with the African rulers of the past. And so al-Maghili in particular is very interesting because he essentially provided the legitimacy for Aski al-Hajj Muhammad in Songhai, the Songhai Empire, to take power from his predecessor. He legitimized that transfer of power by saying that, just like Osman was claiming now, his predecessor had, by his actions, shown himself to be pagan, to be a non-Muslim, and he was correct when he died. This guy died, Sunni Ali died. Aski al-Hajj Muhammad was correct to seize power from his descendants and establish, quote unquote, Orthodox Islam. So we have this idea of orthodoxy again. And so he was very important for the Fodiawa as a historical proof that what they were doing was correct, because it had been done before in the past.
Interesting. In the formation of this legitimacy, were there any opposition, and were there other claimants?
Yes, the question of resistance is interesting because we don't know the full extent of that, because the Fodiawa won. All of these manuscripts, all that we're seeing here is the history of the victor. And we don't know whether the Fodiawa, they may have destroyed certain manuscripts that scholars wrote opposing them, and I think this is far more likely, manuscripts that were written in opposition ceased to have political value after the collapse of the House of States, and so nobody was copying them down because they didn't. And so we have a good example of that in Hamdallahi. So Hamdallahi was another jihadist state in the Mopti region of Mali. And that state collapsed. There's a long history I don't want to go into now, but there's hardly any of the foundational texts of that state remain because the state no longer exists. And so that narrative was no longer important.
I know you mentioned something about this in the historiography. section, I mean, if I remember, you know, this all plays into how the recording of the history of what came to be the Sokoto Caliph or state or caliphate, and essentially the history was being recorded in a certain way. Would you say that might be, would you say that the elimination of opposition inevitably, like you said, writing it from the victor's viewpoint, you know, that's the mode of history, right?
Well, it's unfortunately, you know, in the past, you know, historians and especially written texts from West Africa, they kind of seized upon these as authoritative, unbiased accounts of the past. And, you know, to be fair, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't have these kind of seminal works explaining the kind of chronological events-based histories of these Muslim states. But I want to take a step back and say, okay, these manuscripts were written by the victor to justify the conflict. Okay, so they're probably not very useful in terms of reconstructing the history of what went on during the jihad, but what are they useful for? Well, they're all about legitimacy. They're all about legitimizing this conflict. So why don't we use them to talk about legitimacy and what legitimacy meant in the 19th century? And so that was my approach. You know, I don't.
No. So you clearly did that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't begin to claim that these texts are accurate in the way that they portray historical events, but they're accurate in the way they construct legitimacy because they worked. You know, that's why they're here today. Is because that vision was compelling and lasting.
Brilliant. Yeah. So in the book, what you do then you sort of chart the rise of Sheikh Othman Dan Fodio, and then in a lot of detail, and from his own sort of intellectual practice, the social, cultural, political milieu, and so that our readers must, we have to read that chapter. Of course, we're unable to get Paul to explain, you know, that entire chapter. But what it did get me thinking was, and this is sort of the kind of next question I had in mind, was, okay, so here I think this might be a bit of a sort of trying to piece together different parts of the book, maybe. So I know later on in the book, the near final chapter, you talk about Uthman's successor, although some dispute about the legitimate successor, right? So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Uthman Dan Fodio's successor. Now, the way I was reading, when I was reading that chapter, it kind of just struck at me as this kind of perennial sort of tension we get in statesmen or in persons in government or heads of state. It's the notion of idealism versus pragmatism. Now, that may not be the way, of course, you framed it in the chapter, but I just got this idea of idealism versus pragmatism because of what you mentioned. And here's the quote. So, you know, you mentioned the idealism of youth versus the pragmatism of later years in Mohammed Bello. So you remark that the successor of Uthman Dan Fodio, who was the sort of the sort of primary figure of the original sort of founder as such of this Sokoto state. Bello's pragmatic governance model allowed Sokoto to outlast its neighboring states and maintain a strong cultural presence in the region. It seems that, to me, I'm saying that a young firebrand Mohammed Bello had relaxed and become a less rigid and more pragmatic ruler, a ruler incorporating more of the symbols and traditions of his subjects as part of a wider integration to Sokoto identity. But yet at the same time, we see he has an overtly exclusionary policy against like the Tuaregs and so on. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, compared to the founder or his predecessor, Sheikh Othman Dan Fodio, why do you think maybe Mohammed Bello became more pragmatic? And I know you give examples in the book, and so maybe if you're able to tease some of that out for us, why did it become like, you know, from things being bid'ah and unlawful to like, well, actually, this is part of now the new Sokoto identity, this cultural practices, or, you know, he didn't seem to quite outlaw them as such.
I think that's really well put. I mean, I can I can just give a kind of just a short narrative of what happened. So 1804, you know, the jihad happened.
Yeah.
The House of States were overthrown. Sokoto was kind of growing in strength. At the same time, there was this huge division within the jihadist camp between, you know, this kind of idealistic vision of a perfect Muslim governance as enacted by Prophet Muhammad in Medina or by the rightly guided caliphs, and this pragmatic school that recognized that, yes, a Muslim state like this might look good on paper, but in reality, there had to be certain changes if Sokoto was to survive. And so this actually led to a huge argument between Usman and his younger brother Abdullahi. And then Bello, you know, once he kind of came of age and started to be influential, he took his father's side on this pragmatic direction. And when Usman died in 1817, Muhammad Bello took his place, even though Abdullahi thought that the rulership should go to him. And so he left and started his own rival Muslim state in Gwandu, which was which was in theory allied with Sokoto, but very much did its own thing. And I'll maybe in a few minutes I'll talk about how these states were different. So I want to come back to your question. So, you know, Bello's vision was of this urban society which integrated different groups, different cultures together. And an important point of this was to sedentarize the various nomadic groups that existed in West Africa at this time. You know, foremost among them, the Fulani, you know, the ethnic group to which Bello himself identified. Many of them were nomadic. And the reason for this was it's much easier to control a population that's in an urban setting and that is not nomadic. So he saw nomadism as a threat to this settled, controlled state that he had in mind. And so it's important to see the flip side of this. It might sound a kind of, it might sound almost kind of multicultural and open-minded what he was planning, but the flip side of this, others were excluded, were persecuted, were even enslaved, in fact, especially those populations living on the borders of Sokoto territory. And so some of these ideas he sourced from, you know, classic Muslim political thinkers such as Al-Mawardi. He took a kind of inspiration from Abbasid models of imperial rule, these kind of huge palaces, retinues of servants, etc., etc. You know, from the walled cities of classical Islam, such as Basra, Kufa, Al-Fustat. But, you know, again, this was a very intellectual approach. But, you know, his biggest influence, and I have to just make this very clear, his biggest influence were the house estates that came before them, i.e. the states that they'd overthrown. And as in anywhere, and I think this is just inevitable, that states will eventually reflect their local settings. You know, whatever the ideological reasons for their creation, they will always, if they are to survive, you know, they have to recognize the fact that the local population will eventually, you know, is the majority. In this case, the Hausa were the majority, and you'd have to get them on side if you want to maintain your power. And so the way that Bello did that was to copy the Hausa model of a large royal court with all sorts of royal officers and royal appointments that came with titles, positions, land, captives. You know, why? To get them on side, you know, because otherwise, you know, nobody is invested in the state if they're not benefiting, you know, in terms of their position, in terms of their finances. And the really interesting thing is, you know, we talked about this Nasa, this Arab heritage before. Bello said, oh, actually, we are an African people.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
We are from West Africa. We're not descended from Jews or Christians or Arab conquerors. You know, we are part of this society. And I think one of the reasons he did that, or the main reason he did that, was to assuage these ideas that there's a foreign elite coming to dominate society, which, you know, nobody likes, of course. So, yeah, and we compare this to Gwandu under Abdullahi. So Abdullahi maintained this council of scholars. They were secluded from the rest of the population. They spoke in Fulfulde and Arabic. They did not speak in Hausa. They did not engage with the wider population. and decisions were made collectively among these elite. There was not really any way for the majority non-Fulani population to get into this, to be invested in the state, and as a result, it kind of sank into obscurity pretty quickly.
I know you mentioned, I know you mentioned some of the features that gave Bello's state that longevity. Again, you mentioned the pragmatic posturing, the now identification of African heritage overtly, rather than just a mere external an imposed sort of Arab genealogy.
Exactly.
So yeah, things like that, and how he was sort of less sort of the prohibitions were relaxed, or if not relaxed, sort of overturned on certain cultural practices, regional practices and things like that, where he would in his youth would have condemned to be religious innovation or heresy. So we see these changes, and you say they're markers of his sort of longevity. And at the same time, you also mentioned Abdullahi in Gwandu, some of the reasons for its failure. One of them you mentioned was age. He hit about nearly 60, right? 55 or 60 years old.
Yeah.
And Bello was much younger. The other reason I think you mentioned, according to the sources, was Bello was more of a statesman, surely a princely man, but Abdullahi was more sort of a kind of a Sufi, some man trying to preserve his soul rather than a governor.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was first and foremost a scholar and a kind of legal purist. He lived in these books and these examples from Muslim history, and his authority derived from, as the authority of Usman derived from his knowledge of Islamic law, essentially. But the interesting thing, once Bello gained all of this political power, once his rule of Sokoto was assured, he didn't need to quote, from Maliki scholars or to show that he had all of this knowledge of Islamic law. He didn't need to do that anymore, because his authority was based on the fact that he had been in power for X number of years, and this was clearly what God intended. So he didn't have to prove himself. And it's very interesting to look at these manuscripts that he wrote over time. In the beginning, it's full of quoted text, from Muslim scholars before. When we get to the end of his reign, they're just policy directives. Do this, don't do that. These regions, you can take captives from these regions and not that one. He doesn't quote any authority. The only authority is him, because he is now Amir al-Mu'mineen, as you said.
Yeah. The other interesting thing as well, I mean, Bello in the later sort of rulership, he minimized the role of scholars, right? I mean, he didn't, because it was more top-down authority now. It wasn't consultative with the religious clerics, right?
Yeah, it was bureaucrats, essentially.
Bureaucratic, yeah, exactly,
yeah. And for the most part, and we're talking now probably in the 1850s, after Bello had died, most of these bureaucrats were actually were former slaves. So they had, that was their entry into the political system, was by following up the ranks. And which that is, that's a way to preserve your political power, to kind of essentially not have a government of scholars anymore, but have a government of bureaucrats who owe their position to the kind of the charity of the ruler, if you will.
So even though everyone remembers, even though Gwandu wasn't as grand, lame pun, as grand as but it was still Sokoto. It was still considered to be like the little brother, right? The kind of it still had legitimacy of some sort, didn't it?
It's an interesting. I mean, for me, it's just illustrative of different forms of Muslim authority and different ways that you could structure, a Muslim state. And perhaps Gwandu maybe honed more closely to this kind of legalistic tradition, but it was also a lot less effective, because there was no way for outsiders into this system. So, for example, Sokoto, because of these cities like Kano, produced, leather, dye, textiles,
Yes,
all of
yes.
these products for export. Gwandu was actually situated on much more fertile land. It was further south, further away from the desert. But they couldn't really utilize this because they did not have the cohesiveness. They did not have there was no such thing as a Gwandu identity, this kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic identity, because power still laid in the hands of this very isolated circle of Fulani scholars. They were not able to create this powerful state.
I mean, when I was reading these chapters, Paul, there were so many sort of. I went into literary mode because I was thinking, could this be an example where Bello, the nephew, Abdullahi, the uncle, they have the two different generational thinkers almost. So here could this be the two states, or the Gwandu reflects a certain type of generational thinking, clinging on to tradition, scholarly, whereas Bello, more now new, young, a nephew,
I didn't think about it that way before, but yeah, I mean, some of it was definitely due to their personalities, and as historians, we have very limited access to the personality, because to what extent is our identity defined by what we write? It depends, but you really have to sit down and talk to somebody, which you can't do. But yeah, I think some of it is to do with age, because Abdullahi, when he left Sokoto after being disappointed that he was not going to be made Amir al-Mu'mineen, a lot of the older scholars came with him to Gwandu. So there was definitely a schism between the young and the old there, for sure.
I think was it Bello's successor after him, his brother, wasn't it? Who sort of reversed some of his policies, religious sort of relaxed policies, you could say. He sort of made them again.
That's what some historical chronicles say, is that Atiku, his successor, did try to return a bit of this Puritanism. Well, not Puritanism is the wrong word, but this kind of quote unquote orthodoxy back. But we're too far down that road now, and Sokoto was this dynamic engine that was not really dependent upon the ruler, but upon the economy. This huge economy that it had created. And I want to make this point again. Sokoto could not have got as big as it was without the mass enslavement of the population surrounding their borders, which again was copied from the Hausa period. This was not anything new. It was a return to an old model of the economy, just at a much larger scale. And so what the Amir al-Mu'mineen did or said mattered less now that this kind of economic and political system was established under him.
I'm aware of time. It's fascinating. The more we talk about it. I mean, but okay. So if we were to sort of take things to a kind of a final sort of point of discussion, you do say in your book, in the concluding point, that the theoretical contribution in your book should be of relevance and interest outside of the narrow field of Sokoto studies and outside of African studies more generally. Now, I'm in definitely agreement with you. I guess the question that was in my mind was, okay, given this point, this conclusion you made, and what seems to me a burgeoning sort of literature on what could be called caliphate studies. I don't know if that's an actual label for a subfield of Islamic.
Probably should be, if it's not already.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. If there is something called a caliphate studies, then and of course Muslims, at least scholars, intellectuals, visionaries over the last century, at least since the fall of the official abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, have reimagined the caliphate, whether that's in North Africa, in India, wherever it might be. This reimagination of the caliphate is still has taken on sort of new incarnations, and so I guess what I want to ask is, where where would you like this theoretical contribution, this book, where would you like the reader to take their journey, having read it? I mean, which are the parameters, which are the fields you think they should be taking it to, instead of just keeping it within African studies? Or
no, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Kind of continuing the journey. Yeah, I like that. It's I mean, just as a side note, Osman never. That's why I didn't want to use the word Sokoto Caliphate, because he never actually, because the Ottoman Caliphate and actually the Alawite dynasty in Morocco that claimed the caliphate as well, because they were descended, they claimed descent from Prophet Muhammad. They knew that at least two caliphates existed at the time, and they actually tried to ally themselves with both of these caliphates. So, Sokoto itself never claimed to be a caliphate, but I take your point, nevertheless. And I suppose what I want people to take away from that is that if you want to look at the history of Muslim politics, the history of attempts to create the Muslim state, don't forget about Africa. There are more African Muslims, population-wise, than there are Muslims in the entire Middle East, for example. So, but it's hardly ever used, the African continent is hardly ever used as a model when we're discussing, different forms of Muslim states and political developments in Muslim societies. So I would just encourage, to use Africa as a companion case to perhaps other parts of the Muslim world. And I think secondly, when we're talking about caliphate studies, it's pretty clear that there's no, even among the jihadist camp themselves, there was no agreement as to what the ideal Muslim state should look like. The concept of a Muslim state is relational. It depends what came before as to what is being proposed, afterwards. So a lot of the kind of idealism of Osman's movement came from specific issues from the House of State period. So this idea that the rulers were mixing Islam with paganism, the idea that the rulers were overtaxing their subjects, putting all of these taxes that were not recognized by Islam. It was very specific to their proposal was dependent upon the society and the political system that came before. And it's very interesting now with Boko Haram being in northern Nigeria, and across the Sahel really, and they of course allied with ISIS, with Daesh, a few years ago. And so it's very interesting to see how Boko Haram is drawing historical parallels between their jihad against the Nigerian state and against West African states in general, and the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio. But were Usman Dan Fodio living in that region today, Boko Haram would persecute him for being a Sufi, because for them Sufism is bid'ah, whereas Usman was introducing Qadri Sufism as part of his jihad. And his son Muhammad Bello, even though he was the Muslim ruler, the Amir al-Mu'mineen of this huge empire, would also be persecuted because for his compromises, for his pragmatism. So it's interesting to see that what's stayed the same versus what is different. And I suppose the model to take away: just beware of anybody who claims to be representing pure Muslim governments or Orthodox Islam, because it's always a way for outsiders to gain political power. So if maybe I can just try to explain. By rejecting the political systems that have been put in place before, you're essentially saying, well, I don't need to take part in, I don't need to ascend the ranks of this imposed hierarchy. I want to destroy it all and start again. And so we see the Qadri Sufi order became very entrenched in the later days of Sokoto's history. Then the Tijani Sufi order came along and said, you must belong to the Tijani, you can't have other affiliations. And then the Salafis came along and said, oh, actually, we reject Sufism in all of its forms. And if we see the backgrounds of these people, of these ideologues, they were just outsiders who wanted political power for themselves. So when we see these cycles of legitimation and delegitimation, repeating, to today, and the main issue is that there's still this idea that Islam is this monolithic thing, you know, that can either be performed correctly or incorrectly, when of course it's this discursive tradition of communities, of people, and that can be used as a force for change, or as a force for stability. As I say, traditions of dissent, traditions of moderation, all of them are encompassed within you know, what you might call Islamic discursive tradition.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. And I know you emphasize it in several places that these, as you put it now, these cycles of legitimation, these markers, they're applicable to the trans-regional, you know, the trans-historical, wherever we see new power dynamics being negotiated, or statecraft, state building, we're going to see ideas of legitimacy crop up again, and how they're negotiated in that construction of a particular state. So I think, you know, it's an excellent book for all, not just ILS community, but beyond. And I'm sure as time goes by, and then, you know, it becomes more and more prominent on the reading list, and because it's just, you know, published, I think it's going to become more and more important for this contribution. It's going to be important for us to widen our own field of research, our own examples, our own often, unfortunately, narrow case studies that we look at. And you've really thrown that wide open, brought to the English reader the way, the dynamics of how a Muslim, you know, governance was established bottom up. And so it's fascinating, all based on rigorous research. I mean, if I was able to show the book, it's got a huge appendix, we've got a glossary. I mean, you've got about, I don't even know how many pages of bibliography, but I mean, it's a considerable amount. A lot of work is done for the reader for that. So in order for, you know, to get these details, a lot of the hard work has been done. And I hope that, you know, people take up what's been mentioned here by the author, what's been discussed. I wish we could, you know, devote a time, maybe we will, where we can get into the micro features of the book, and bring the debate, you know, and connect it to other wider issues of relevance. So, I mean, I have to regrettably so draw this episode to a close. I remind everyone to follow up on From Rebels to Rulers, Writing Legitimacy in the Early Sokoto State. It's off the press, and it's by James Curry, and any library, I'm sure, will have it. If not, if you are in charge of any budget, then please do get it onto your library catalogues. And
Dr.
Paul,
just to mention, there
please.
is an ebook as well, which is more reasonably priced, and hopefully there will be a paperback edition coming out. So
brilliant. So there are different formats available as an ebook, and then hopefully soon a paperback. But before I do close it, Paul, is there anything that you're doing, that anything at the moment that you're writing on or working on, other than the wonderful work of preserving this West African heritage, literary heritage?
We mentioned about kind of literary pedigree. Well, I just published an article on Mohammed Bellows, all of the books that he read and the teachers that he studied them with. And brilliant. Again, it's quite interesting to see how that compares with the reading list of his uncle. So I show them both in parallel. That's in an article that I think you can find me on academia.edu. You can get the paper there or elsewhere. So I'm still working on there. Yeah. Excellent.
No, we really do thank your time. We know how the busy schedule you have, and I hope, and I think for sure we will have a part 2 on this, a follow up, simply because, you know, we're only really scratched some thematic issues in this episode. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Follow this conversation, share the information about the book, and like we said, get this conversation going. We appreciate your time and your support for ILS. Until our next episode, Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده، إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.